My husband did not come back to the hospital. Not on day 2. Not on day 3. Not on day 4. I told myself he was handling things at home. Told myself the house didn't run itself and that a man could only be in one place at a time. I told myself a lot of things in that hospital room while the IV dripped and the nurses changed shifts, and the window showed me the same slice of Charlotte sky turning from gray to dark to gray again. A hysterectomy takes something from you that has no clean name, not just the physical, the weight of what it means, what it closes, what it confirms. Mine had turned more complicated than expected halfway through surgery. The doctors said everything was fine afterward, but they kept me longer for monitoring because my blood levels dropped lower than they liked. I was 4 days into what became a 5-day stay, and I had cried exactly once, quietly, with my face turned toward the wall so the night nurse wouldn't see. The rest of the time, I held myself together the way women like me learn to. Not because we are strong, but because falling apart in a room where no one is coming feels like too much of a surrender. On the 4th night, I picked up my phone because the silence had become its own kind of pressure. I opened Facebook because that is where my world lives. Church friends, old neighbors, the running stream of other people's ordinary days. I needed ordinary. I needed to see someone's grandchild or someone's Sunday dinner plate. Anything but this room. Davian's wedding photographs loaded first. I did not know the wedding was that day. I had been told it was still being finalized. I had been told, and I had believed because I had no reason not to, that the date was still weeks away. But there it was, the ceremony, the reception, tables full of people I recognized and some I didn't. My son dancing with his new wife, laughing with his head thrown back the way he laughed when he was 7 years old. And Byron. In a suit I had never seen, charcoal gray, perfectly fitted, standing easy and celebratory in the way of a man who has absolutely nothing to manage. Beside him stood a woman. She wasn't hovering at the edge of the frame. She wasn't uncertain. She was placed. In every photograph. Beside my husband. Beside my son. Positioned the way family is positioned. The caption read, "What a joyful day." Thank you to my real mother and father for everything. I read it once. I read it twice. I read it a 3rd time because some things your mind refuses to process on the first pass. My husband had liked the post, a small thumbs up beneath my son's words. Simple, casual, like it cost him nothing. If you have ever had to hold yourself together in a room where no one could see you falling apart, stay with me. Because what happened next changed everything. Drop what time you are watching in the comments. I want to know who is here with me tonight. 30 minutes passed. I know it was 30 because I watched the time in the corner of my screen without meaning to. The way you watch something when your mind has gone somewhere it cannot come back from quickly. Then my phone lit up. A number I did not recognize. No name, no context. Just 7 words. Don't say a word. I'll handle it. I stared at that message for a long time. I did not respond. I did not know if I should be frightened or relieved or something else entirely. Something that didn't have a word yet. Someone knew something. Someone was watching something I could not see from this bed. I placed the phone face down on the tray beside me. The tears came then. I let them. But underneath them, quiet, formless, not yet fully conscious. Something else had already begun. Sleep did not come. I didn't fight it. I lay in that hospital bed with the lights dimmed and the corridor quiet, and I did something I had never done before in 22 years of marriage. I went back through every month of it with new eyes, not searching for pain. Searching for the exact moment I stopped seeing clearly, and started accepting explanations I would once have questioned. It started 22 months ago. That was the number I kept landing on. 22 months since Byron mentioned a woman he had connected with through a professional network. A logistics consultant, he said. Someone who understood the freight industry and had expressed interest in his concept. He was casual about it, the way you mention a work contact over dinner, something that belongs to his world and not yours. I asked a few questions. He answered them easily. I moved on. That was the first thing I stopped looking at closely. The late nights came 4 months after that. He called it the project expanding, said the concept was gaining traction and that the groundwork required hours he couldn't find during the day. I believed him. I had my own work, my own deadlines, my own rhythm. A busy husband was not automatically a suspicious husband, especially not one who still came home, still remembered anniversaries, still kissed your forehead while making coffee in the morning. Then the warmth between us shifted. Not suddenly, gradually, the way a room cools when someone leaves a window open somewhere you can't find. He called it the natural settling of a long marriage. He said it with such calm certainty that I accepted it more than questioned it. I had no evidence of anything else. No lipstick on collars, no secret second phone, no dramatic mistakes. Just distance arriving, slowly enough to feel explainable. I thought about the suit. Charcoal gray, perfectly fitted, a suit I had never seen inside our closet or on any hanger in any room of that house. A man does not buy a suit like that for an ordinary meeting. He buys it for a moment. For a specific day, he has already imagined himself inside. How long had he had it? Where had he worn it before today? What other days had there been that I knew nothing about? Looking back, what unsettled me most was not any single lie. It was how individually reasonable everything had seemed while it was happening. No one change large enough to force confrontation. No one explanation strange enough to collapse under its own weight. Just small adjustments. Tiny repositionings. One believable thing placed carefully beside another until an entirely different reality had been built around me without my noticing it happening. Cheryl called at midnight. I answered because not answering would have required an explanation I didn't have the energy to construct. I told her about the post, not the text, not yet. Just the photographs, just the caption. Just Byron's thumbs up sitting beneath my son's words like a signature. She didn't perform shock. Cheryl has never been that kind of woman. What came through the phone was quiet and specific. The anger of someone who loves you and is watching you be wronged and cannot reach through the line to stop it. She said she was coming. I told her no, not yet. I needed to understand the shape of what I was looking at before I let anyone else into the room with it. After we hung up, I opened the post one more time. I did not look at Byron this time. I looked at the woman. She was in every photograph. Positioned beside my husband, beside my son, placed with the confidence of someone who belonged there. But something in her posture stopped me. She was slightly apart in each frame. Not hovering, not uncertain, but not fully settled either. There was a carefulness in the way she stood, even in the middle of a celebration, that didn't match the role she was being placed in. I didn't know what to do with that yet. So I filed it away and let it sit. Something about that woman was not what I was being told she was. The nurse set the envelope on my tray without ceremony. Large, manila, sealed. My room number written on the front in careful, unhurried handwriting. No name, no return address. Nothing else. She said it had been left at the front desk the previous evening. Someone had called ahead, claimed they were sending flowers on behalf of Byron Hollis. Needed to confirm the room number to coordinate delivery. Hospitals do that. They confirm rooms for deliveries without releasing anything medical. Byron had tagged the hospital in one of the wedding reception photographs and mentioned my recovery in the comments beneath it. Whoever left this envelope already knew where I was before they ever called. They used my husband's name to confirm the room and never had to show their face. I opened it slowly. Inside was a folder, organized, deliberate, the kind of order that takes time and intention to produce. I recognized immediately that whoever assembled this had not done it in a hurry. Financial transfer records, screenshot exchanges between Byron and a contact saved in someone's phone as Solvi D business proposal documents for something called Hollis Freight Solutions. Formatted professionally, specific enough to sound credible, vague enough that you would need industry knowledge to verify the numbers. Emails soliciting investment. And underneath everything, a single page I recognized without needing to read the header. A certified copy of my marriage certificate pulled through Mecklenburg County Public Records. I set that page down and picked up the handwritten note tucked inside the back cover. It said, "He told me he was divorced. I believed him. I'm sorry. You deserved better than both of us leaving you alone in here." I read it once. I set it down. I read the documents, every page, twice. Then I picked the note up and read it again. I did not cry. Something past crying had come online, something cooler and more focused than anything I had felt in 4 days. I worked through the financials with the same attention I give contracts at work. Byron had asked for $47,000. The documents showed $31,000 actually transferred. 2 separate installments, dates listed, account references included. I looked at those dates. I looked at where they fell against the timeline I had reconstructed the night before. The first transfer landed 3 months after Byron told me the investor was simply someone he'd connected with professionally. He was collecting money from her while telling me she was a business contact. I looked at the name again. Solvi D, the unsaved number. 7 words the night before. Don't say a word. I'll handle it. I knew now who sent it. The same woman who called the hospital using my husband's name to confirm my room number without ever being seen. The same woman who assembled this folder and left it at a front desk for a wife she had never met. I did not know yet what had brought her to that decision, what she had seen or discovered or felt that made her move this way. But the note told me something no document could. She wrote leaving you alone in here. She knew about the surgery. She knew I was in this room, and she was angry about it, not at me. That distinction was in every word of that apology. This woman was not my enemy. I reached for my phone. I called Cheryl, and this time I told her everything. The envelope, the folder, the transfer records, the marriage certificate, the note, the unsaved number, all of it. I heard her go completely quiet on the other end of the line. Not the quiet of someone processing, the quiet of someone who has just understood that this is much larger than either of us realized. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then Cheryl said, "Alora, you need a lawyer." I was home by 10 in the morning. I want to be clear about what that decision meant, because walking back through that door was not weakness and it was not confusion. I was not going back to Byron. I was going back to everything I had built before him and alongside him and in spite of him. Every payment I had made toward that mortgage, every room I had furnished and maintained and kept. I was not leaving any of it in his hands one day longer than I absolutely had to. And I was not about to let him watch me flee so he could reframe my absence as the story he needed it to be. I walked in and I stayed. The house felt different, not changed, just exposed, the way a familiar room looks after someone has moved through it without your knowledge. Same furniture, same light through the same windows, but I moved through it differently now. Cheryl arrived an hour later with food I hadn't asked for and an energy I recognized immediately. Not sympathy, assessment. She had been up thinking, and she had arrived knowing what came next. That is the specific quality of a friendship that has survived enough to stop being gentle when gentle is not what is needed. She set the food down, sat at the kitchen table, and I gave her the folder. She read it the way I had, methodically, without performance. She did not gasp. She did not shake her head slowly for effect. She read every page, and when she finished, she looked up and asked me a question I was not prepared for. "What is in your name alone?" I told her. The car. A savings account I had opened before the marriage that Byron had no access to. Some work-related assets tied to my professional accounts. She asked about the mortgage. Joint, I told her. Both names. She asked how much Byron controlled from our shared accounts. I gave her the number and heard it land differently out loud than it ever had inside my head. She asked what I could access independently right now, today, without his involvement. I told her that too. I heard myself answering, and what I heard was the shape of my own exposure. I was not without resources. But I had trusted Byron with the architecture of our financial life, the way you trust someone after decades of building something together. Without auditing, without suspicion, without ever imagining you would need to know the exact dimensions of what you had handed over. Cheryl nodded once and then told me something she had been carrying. 4 months ago, she attended a professional reception in Charlotte. Byron was there with a woman. Cheryl had met her briefly once through a mutual contact, knew her as a logistics consultant who worked with several firms in the area. She assumed it was a work dinner. She meant to mention it to me, and then my surgery preparations consumed everything, and the moment passed. She told me this without apology performance. She was simply placing a piece of information where it now belonged. I asked her one question. I opened the wedding photographs on my phone and held the screen toward her. She looked. She said yes. Same woman. I put the phone down. Cheryl mentioned a name then, Renata Pasco, a family law attorney she knew through a professional connection, not a friend, a known quantity. She described her plainly, a woman who handled complicated asset cases and did not lose things she should win. She gave me the name the way you hand someone a tool and let them decide when to pick it up. I wrote it down. I was not ready to call yet, but I wrote it down. Byron called at 7 that evening. His voice was warm and measured, the warmth of a man who believes the person on the other end of the line knows nothing and therefore requires managing carefully. He asked how I was feeling. He said he would come by tomorrow. I told him that was fine. I kept my voice easy and gave him nothing to read. When I hung up, I looked at my hands. They were completely steady. That steadiness told me something I hadn't been able to name until that moment, that some part of me had already decided what came next, even before the rest of me had caught up. Byron arrived at 9 with groceries he hadn't been asked to buy and a careful attentiveness that would have moved me 2 weeks ago. He carried my bag from the car. He asked about my pain levels with his brow slightly creased in the way of a man performing concern he has practiced enough to believe himself. He had stocked the kitchen, the specific things I liked, the brand of tea I kept on the second shelf. He remembered details. He always remembered details. I understood now that remembering details was not the same as being present. I let him be attentive. I thanked him where thanking was appropriate. I moved through the morning beside him and gave him nothing to read. When he left for what he called a meeting, I started moving through the house properly. I was not looking for something dramatic. Byron was not a careless man. I understood that clearly now. Careless men get caught early. I was not trying to prove what the folder had already shown me. I was trying to understand how much of his other life had been passing through mine while I was still calling it marriage. What I was looking for was the specific residue of a life lived alongside mine without my knowledge. The kind of residue that doesn't announce itself. The kind you only find when you know to look. Near the entryway, I found a phone charger plugged into the wall socket behind the side table. Not his model, not mine. I photographed it and kept moving. In the kitchen drawer, the one we used for takeout menus and miscellaneous papers, I found a receipt. A restaurant in the South End I had never been to. The date was a Tuesday evening 3 months ago. Byron had told me that Tuesday he was at a supply chain conference in Raleigh. He had texted me from the road. I had texted back and told him to drive safe. I photographed the receipt and closed the drawer exactly as I had found it. Then I went to his office. I took my time in there. I did not pull things apart. I moved through the space the way you move through something you need to understand, rather than something you need to ransack. His desk, his filing cabinet, the legal pad on the left side of the desk, where he kept handwritten notes he considered temporary. Inside the legal pad, I found a business card from a commercial real estate firm in Charlotte. On the back, in Byron's handwriting, a square footage figure and a monthly lease estimate for warehouse space in a Charlotte industrial district. Tucked beneath it was a printed email thread about available units in the same area. Availability timelines. Loading dock specifications. He had not been theorizing a business. He had been building one, scouting physical space, running numbers, using language that meant he had already spoken to someone in person. I photographed both. I sat down in his chair. Then I called Renata Pasco. Her assistant answered. I gave my name and said I needed a consultation on a family law matter. I had a date within the week. When I hung up, I stayed in that chair, Byron's chair, in Byron's office, inside the house we shared, and felt the first clean thing I had felt since before the surgery. Not anger, not satisfaction, just direction. The specific relief of a next step that has been taken and cannot be untaken. Byron came home at 6. I was on the couch with the television on. He made tea without being asked, and set it beside me and settled in at the other end of the couch, like a man with nothing pressing on his conscience. I sipped the tea. I thanked him. He did not know about the photographs. He did not know about Renata Pasco. He sat 2 feet away from me and believed with complete confidence that everything was contained. He was wrong about that. He had been wrong about that since the folder arrived. 3 days after I came home, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I had learned to answer carefully. I picked up without saying my name, just held the line and waited. The voice on the other end was young and slightly uncertain in the specific way of someone who has rehearsed what they plan to say and is now discovering that the actual moment feels different from the rehearsal. She said, "Mrs. Williams, this is Loria." She paused. Davian's wife. I sat down. She did not explain why she was calling from a number I didn't have. She didn't need to. The fact that she had a separate number Byron didn't have access to and had chosen to use it told me enough about the kind of caution already moving through that household. She said she'd been thinking about me since the wedding. She said she noticed I wasn't there. Her voice was direct but uneven in places, like someone trying to sound more certain than they actually felt. Once she lost her place completely and started a sentence over. She told me the explanation she had been given, that I was recovering, and had insisted they not delay the ceremony on my account, that I had specifically asked to be left alone to rest. She admitted she almost accepted it. Said she told herself maybe every family handled difficult moments differently. But something about the reception had stayed with her afterward in a way she couldn't shake. I asked what she meant. There was a pause. Then she said it felt strange hearing people speak around me all evening, like I had simply decided not to come. Like you were a scheduling issue instead of his mother. The honesty of that landed harder than anything rehearsed would have. She said she almost didn't call, said she had picked up her phone twice the day before and put it back down again because she didn't want to begin her marriage creating problems with her husband's family. Then she laughed once, nervous, embarrassed with herself. She said, "I still might have made a mistake." I told her she hadn't. Then she asked quietly, "Are you okay?" I told her I was recovering. I told her I appreciated her reaching out. I told her I hoped we could talk properly sometime, and I meant every word of it. I gave her nothing about the folder, nothing about Renata Pasco, nothing about any of it. What she had offered was her hand across a distance neither of us had built, and I received it for exactly that. Nothing more, nothing less. The call lasted 11 minutes. When it ended, I sat with the phone in my lap and thought about what it had cost her to make it. Davian didn't know about it. Byron certainly didn't. She had made that call from her own private discomfort because something in her refused to perform ease she didn't feel. That kind of integrity is not common. I recognized it and I held it carefully. What I learned later, not that night, but eventually, through Loria herself, was what happened when she told Davian she had called me. She mentioned it that evening, quietly, without making it a confrontation. His reaction was not anger. He was not that kind of man. But his discomfort was immediate and specific. He said his father had told him I needed space, that I had asked to be left alone during recovery, that reaching out would have been going against what I wanted. He said it with the calm certainty of someone repeating something they have heard enough times that it has stopped feeling like someone else's words and started feeling like their own conclusion. Loria said she had just wanted to check. Davian said she didn't understand the whole situation. For a second, she almost pushed back harder. She told me later she could feel herself getting irritated, not at him exactly, but at how quickly he defended something that didn't fully make sense even to him. But she stopped herself. It was their first week married. She was still learning the shape of the family she had entered, so she let the conversation end. But she looked at her husband differently afterward, like a man carrying a story he had been given so carefully and so gradually that he could no longer see the seams in it. I didn't know any of that yet. That night, I only knew that one person connected to my son had reached across the silence. It was enough to notice. The office was quiet in the way of a place where serious things get decided without ceremony. No artwork trying too hard, no aggressive mahogany, just clean surfaces, good light, and a woman sitting across from me who looked at the folder the way a surgeon looks at a scan, not with feeling, with information. Renata Pasco was exactly what Cheryl had described. She did not perform reassurance. She did not tell me everything was going to be fine. She opened the folder. She reviewed the photographs from Byron's office. She went through 3 months of joint account statements line by line. And when she finished, she set everything down and told me exactly where I stood. North Carolina divides marital assets based on fairness given the full circumstances, she said. That meant documentation of how assets were used during the marriage was not incidental, it was central. What I had in that folder was not just evidence of betrayal, it was evidence of a pattern. Byron had used marital time, marital resources, and the financial credibility he built inside our marriage to construct a fraudulent scheme outside of it. Courts had language for that. Dissipation of marital assets. And courts could account for it directly in what I walked away with. She explained the adultery ground without softening it. North Carolina recognized it as legal basis for divorce. More specifically, a spouse who committed adultery could be barred entirely from receiving post-separation support or long-term alimony, depending on the circumstances. The court also had discretion to award support to the wronged spouse when the facts supported it. She said facts, and looked briefly at the folder without pointing to anything specific. She didn't need to point. Then she asked about Solvi. Had I been in contact? I told her not directly. I had received documents, but we had not spoken. She nodded once and told me that communication with Solvi, carefully structured, could be the difference between a strong case and an overwhelming one. If Solvi was willing to provide a formal statement, or testimony if it came to that, the pattern Renata could build around Byron's conduct would become very difficult to challenge. 2 women, documented financial solicitation, a marriage he concealed from one while living inside it with the other. That was not a single incident. That was a pattern of deception supported by records. She gave me 3 instructions before I left. Do not confront Byron. Do not move money or change anything about how the joint accounts are operating without speaking to her first. Do not alter any behavior at home that he would notice or question. Let him believe everything is exactly as he thinks it is for as long as possible. The longer Byron felt safe, she said, the more useful that safety became to us. A man who believes he is not being watched does not manage himself carefully. And a man who does not manage himself carefully makes mistakes that end up documented somewhere. I listened to all of it. I asked 2 questions, both practical. She answered both directly. When I walked out of that office onto the street in uptown Charlotte, the afternoon was bright and ordinary around me, people moving, traffic passing, the city operating at its usual indifferent pace. I stood on the pavement for a moment and felt something I had not felt since before the surgery. Not anger, not relief exactly, something more durable than both. I had walked into that office carrying damage someone else had done to me. I walked out with a process. And a process, once started, does not require my emotion to keep moving. It moves on its own. I texted the unsaved number on a Tuesday morning sitting at my own kitchen table while Byron was in the shower upstairs. I read everything in the folder. I'd like to talk, if you're willing. I set the phone down and waited. The response came in less than an hour. A coffee shop in a part of Charlotte that belonged to neither of our neighborhoods. 2 days from now. Noon. Nothing else. I arrived 10 minutes early. I chose a table near the back with sightlines to the door and ordered water and waited. When she walked in, I recognized her immediately, not just from the wedding photographs, but from the way she carried herself. Composed, deliberate. A woman who had decided exactly what she was walking into before she walked into it. She sat down across from me, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Not from awkwardness, exactly. From the specific weight of 2 women sitting across from each other who have been made to occupy opposite corners of the same man's deception. That weight needed a second to settle. She spoke first. She told me she met Byron 20 months ago at a logistics industry event in Charlotte. He was engaging and specific in the way that registers as genuine. The kind of man who remembers what you said 20 minutes ago and builds on it. He told her he was divorced, that the marriage had ended amicably 2 years before, that he and his former wife remained civil for the sake of their son. She said he delivered it the way you deliver something that is simply true. No heaviness, no performance, just fact. The investment conversation developed over 6 months. He was building a freight brokerage. He needed capital for warehouse leasing and initial fleet contracts. She believed in the concept, and she believed in him. And she transferred $31,000 across 2 installments. When he came back for the remaining $16,000, something shifted in her. She couldn't name it precisely, just a pressure in the ask that felt different from the confidence he usually carried. She stalled. She kept finding reasons to delay. She never transferred it. That instinct, she said, kept her watching closely enough to catch what came next. She attended the wedding as his guest. She believed she was simply meeting his son and the new family. During the reception, a guest made an offhand comment about Byron's wife. Casual, contextual, the kind of thing said by someone who assumes everyone in the room already knows. Solvi registered it and said nothing. She spent the following days pulling at that thread quietly. 2 weeks later, at a dinner hosted by a man named Dwight Calloway, a colleague seated near her mentioned my name directly, connected it to Byron, connected it to the wedding, connected it to a marriage that was apparently still very much intact. The pieces finished assembling themselves that night. She compiled the folder before she slept. She delivered it the next morning. When she finished, I opened my phone to the bank statements Renata had flagged. I turned the screen toward her and pointed to a single line. A transfer from our joint account to Byron's business account. $8,400, dated 4 months before her first installment reached him. She looked at the figure. Then she looked at me. She understood. Byron had used our marital money to build enough infrastructure to look credible. He used my money to position himself to take hers. The stillness that crossed her face was not grief. It was a woman quietly, precisely, revising everything she had believed about her own judgment. Then she asked me one question. "What do you need from me?" I told her. A formal statement for my attorney. Testimony if it reached that point. And whatever she was already planning, I was not asking her to stop. She nodded once. The meeting lasted 40 minutes total. When we stood to leave, Byron Hollis had no idea that the 2 women he had positioned on opposite sides of his life had just sat down together and closed the distance completely. Byron was home more than usual that week, and I watched him the way you watch something you have already decided about. Not searching anymore, not hoping for a different answer. Just observing. Documenting internally. Waiting for the proceedings to run their course. He made dinner on Tuesday. He made dinner again on Thursday. He moved around our kitchen with an ease that should have felt domestic and familiar, but now read differently to me. Like a man making himself visible on purpose, occupying the space of a good husband with the deliberateness of someone who needs that image maintained. He asked about my recovery each morning. The pain levels. Whether I had called the doctor. Whether I was sleeping well. I answered each question with enough warmth to satisfy him and not 1 degree more. It cost me nothing. I was no longer invested in what his concern meant or didn't mean. I received it the way you receive weather, noted, processed, moved on. On Wednesday afternoon, he went into his office and closed the door. I was in the living room. I did not move toward that door. I did not need to. I already had what mattered, and confirming the scale of his deception was no longer my responsibility. But I tracked the time without meaning to, and when he came out 40 minutes later, the specific quality of his presence had changed. He was managing something. Not the easy management of a man solving a routine problem. The tighter, more internal management of a man whose plan is encountering friction he did not schedule. He came into the living room and sat down and picked up his phone, and I watched him from the corner of my eye and said nothing. Twice, he opened a message and locked the screen again without responding. Then his phone rang. He stared at the screen long enough that I noticed it before he finally stood and stepped into the kitchen to answer. His voice stayed low, controlled, but not controlled enough. I heard one sentence clearly. I said, "Give her a little time." A pause, then sharper this time, not loud, but tight around the edges in a way Byron almost never allowed himself to sound. "No. Don't do anything yet." When he came back into the living room, he carried himself too carefully, like a man suddenly aware of his own movements. He sat down, unlocked his phone, locked it again, then asked if I wanted tea even though I still had a full cup beside me. Whatever was fraying on his end was no longer theoretical. It had started reaching into the room with us. Davian called that evening just after 7. The call was brief and slightly constructed. He asked about my health in the way of someone who has thought in advance about what they will say and is now saying it as naturally as they can manage. I was warm with him. Easy. I gave him nothing that required a reaction. I asked about Loria. He said she was good. A pause. He said he was glad I was recovering well. I said I appreciated him calling. When we hung up, I sat with the shape of that conversation for a moment. 2 weeks ago, it would have hurt more than it did. Now, I understood it differently. Davian was still inside a story his father had been building for years, a story assembled so gradually and so carefully that it had stopped feeling like a story and started feeling like memory. You cannot dismantle that in a single phone call. You can only stay present and patient, and let the truth find its own way through. I could afford patience now. That was new. That night, I lay beside Byron in our bed and listened to him breathe and thought about Renata Pascoe's office and Solvi's attorney and the paperwork already moving quietly through Charlotte offices and legal inboxes outside this bedroom window. Byron's breathing was slow and even. He was sleeping. He believed everything was contained. My phone lit up on the nightstand. A message from Solvi. 3 words. Dwight confirmed Thursday. I read it once. I turned the screen face down. I closed my eyes. Thursday was 2 days away. I did not go to the dinner. I sat in my living room with the television off, and Cheryl on the phone, not talking, just present. Her breathing on the other end of the line was enough. The evening was quiet in the way of something held at a distance that you know is not actually quiet at all. I watched the clock without meaning to. 7, 7:40, 8:20. I knew the dinner had started. I knew Solvi was there. I knew Byron. I was there, comfortable and unsuspecting in the home of a man who had respected him for years. I knew what was coming, and still I sat with the not knowing of it. The particular stillness of a person waiting for a sound they cannot hear from where they are standing. At 9:14, my phone rang. Loria. I could hear the night air behind her voice. She was outside, in a parking lot, the slight acoustic openness of someone who had stepped away from an enclosed space to make a call they needed privacy for. And underneath the night air, something else. The specific, slightly shaken quality of a person who has just watched something irreversible happen and is still standing in the middle of understanding that they were in the room when it did. She told me everything, not summarized, in order. Solvi arrived midway through the dinner. Byron was already there. Dwight Calloway's home was familiar ground for him, the kind of place where he was known and comfortable and had no reason to be anything other than himself. He saw Solvi come in, and whatever he felt in that moment, he managed it the way he managed everything, smoothly, without visible seams. He thought she was a woman who had gone quiet the way people go quiet when they have decided to accept a loss and move forward. He had misread her silence completely. Midway through dinner, Solvi stood up. She did not raise her voice. Loria said that was the thing. She did not raise her voice once. She stood, and she spoke clearly, and she told every person at that table what Byron Hollis had done. She named the lie about the divorce. She described the investment solicitation. She said the amount, $31,000 across 2 transfers. And then she said my name. She told them that while Byron sat at his son's wedding celebrating with the woman he had defrauded, his wife was alone in a hospital bed, recovering from surgery that he had visited once and abandoned. At first, nobody really moved. Loria said people looked at Byron before they looked at the papers, almost automatically, waiting for him to laugh it off or explain it into something smaller. Solvi had printed documents. She passed them around the table. One man refused to take them at first, said there had to be some mistake. Byron seized that opening immediately. Loria said his voice stayed calm, slightly wounded, almost embarrassed for Solvi, like he was trying to rescue her from overreacting instead of rescuing himself. He called it a misunderstanding. Said she was a disgruntled business contact blurring personal and professional issues. Then somebody across the table quietly read aloud one of Byron's text messages, where he explicitly claimed he had been divorced for 2 years. The room changed after that. Not loudly. Worse. Chairs stopped moving. Nobody touched their food anymore. Dwight's wife picked up the second page and kept reading without saying a word. Someone else asked Byron directly if the transfers were real. Byron started answering the question and stopped halfway through, because there was no version of the answer that helped him. Loria said that was the moment she realized he knew he was losing the room. Dwight Calloway finally set his papers down. He looked at Byron across his own dining table for a long moment before asking everybody else to give them a minute. Nobody really left. They only drifted far enough away to pretend privacy. Whatever Dwight said next was quiet. Loria couldn't hear it clearly, but Byron answered once in a sharper voice than anyone there had heard from him all night. Dwight answered back, even quieter. Then Dwight opened the front door, and Byron left. Loria's voice was quiet by the time she finished. She said, "I was sitting right there. I watched the whole thing happen. I asked her one question. Was Davian there?" "Yes." He was at that table. He watched his father walk out of Dwight Calloway's home while printed evidence of fraud was still sitting in people's hands. Loria said he drove home without speaking a single word. She said she didn't know what he was feeling. She said something cracked in him tonight, and she didn't know yet what it meant, but she knew it was real. I thanked her. I clicked back to Cheryl. We stayed on the line for another hour. Neither of us said very much. We didn't need to. I heard the front door at 12:43. I did not get up. I lay still and listened to him move through the house, the kitchen. First, the tap running briefly, then his office, the door closing softly behind him, the way it does when he is trying not to wake me. Then the bathroom. Then nothing. I tracked his movement the way you track something you are no longer afraid of, but are still watching carefully. He did not come to the bedroom. At 3 a.m, I got up and checked. Office couch. He was lying on his side with his shoes still on and one arm across his face. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Then I went back to bed. He was in the kitchen when I came downstairs at 7, standing at the counter with a coffee he had barely touched, wearing the specific expression of a man who has been rehearsing a conversation since before the sun came up. Something moved across his face when he saw me. Not quite shame, not quite calculation, something uncomfortably between the two. He asked if I had been hearing things, from people, from our social circle. His voice was measured and light, the voice of someone fishing carefully enough that they believe you cannot see the line. I said people had been checking in since the surgery. The usual. He nodded. He tried a different angle. He mentioned Dwight Calloway, said there had been some unpleasantness at a dinner the previous evening, that someone had made accusations he needed to address, that things had been taken out of context. He watched my face while he said it. I gave him warm and slightly tired and mildly interested. Nothing else. He tried once more. He asked if I knew a woman named Solvi Dean. I looked at him steadily across our kitchen, and I said, "Should I?" The shift in him was immediate and internal. He could not locate what I knew from my face because my face was not giving him a single point of entry. He had been looking for the edges of what I understood, and I had shown him none. He set his coffee down. He said they needed to talk. I said I knew. I told him I had retained an attorney and that Renata Pascoe's office would be reaching out to whatever counsel he decided to use. Then I finished my coffee. I did not raise my voice. I did not move from where I was standing. I simply stopped talking and let the information occupy the room at whatever size it needed to be. He did not rage. Byron Hollis went completely still. The specific stillness of a man whose next move depends entirely on information he does not have and cannot get. That stillness told me more than any rage would have. Rage is what men do when they still believe they can change the outcome. Stillness is what comes after. Loria called at 2 that afternoon. Her voice had changed. The careful, measured quality of our first 2 calls was gone entirely. She had driven home the night before beside a man who did not speak, and she had been thinking about me since the parking lot. She said she was sorry it had taken her this long to understand what I had been carrying. I told her she had nothing to apologize for. She couldn't have known what she wasn't shown. I meant every word of it. We stayed on the phone for 20 minutes. It was the first real conversation we had ever had. Davian had not called. His silence sat in the room with everything else, not hostile, not permanent, but present, real. Its own kind of statement that I was not yet ready to answer. Renata filed on a Tuesday morning. I was not in her office when she did it. I was in my kitchen drinking coffee and watching the light come through the window the way it does in Charlotte in the early morning. Flat and clean and indifferent to everything happening beneath it. My phone showed a text from Renata at 8:52. 2 words. It's filed. I read it and set the phone down and finished my coffee. The filing named adultery and dissipation of marital assets. It was not a letter, not a warning, not an opening gesture designed to prompt negotiation. It was a completed legal document with specific figures, documented timelines, transfer records, and a court date already attached. Renata had built it carefully over the weeks since our consultation. Byron's relationship with Solvi mapped against our marital financial records. The $8,400 transfer placed exactly where it belonged in the sequence. The pattern assembled into language that courts recognize and cannot easily dismiss. The same week, Solvi's attorney filed a civil claim in a separate court. Fraudulent inducement, misrepresentation of marital status, recovery of the $31,000, transferred across 2 installments. The claim included the text exchange where Byron had explicitly told Solvi he was divorced, his own words in the record, attached to a filing that now had a case number. 2 courts, 2 filings, 1 man named in both simultaneously. What happened afterward did not unfold all at once. It moved over weeks, then months, in the slow procedural way most real consequences move. I learned about it through Renata and through the particular way news travels inside professional communities once something enters the public record. Byron's contacts in Charlotte began creating distance. Not loudly, there was no announcement, no public statement, no organized response. Quietly. The way people move when they have read something they cannot unread and have decided that proximity to the named party now carries a cost they are unwilling to absorb. Meetings that had been pending stopped being scheduled. Emails that would once have received immediate replies began sitting unanswered for days. By the 2nd month, Dwight Calloway had simply stopped including Byron in things. In a community where inclusion was its own form of currency, that withdrawal spent like a verdict. Byron retained an attorney within the week. His attorney contacted Renata's office. Then came the financial disclosures, the requests for documentation, the negotiations that stretched across conference calls and legal correspondence I never personally saw. Renata told me about those conversations in the same direct way she told me everything, without drama, without performance. She said Byron's opening position reflected a man who had not yet fully accounted for what the documentation showed. She said her counter had been structured to make the dimensions of his actual position very clear. She used the phrase, limited room. As the weeks passed, that room narrowed further. I did not need to be present for any of it. That was the part I kept returning to. The machinery was moving entirely on its own. I had built the conditions for it and handed it to people who knew what to do with it, and now it was running without requiring my presence or my emotion or my continued attention to any individual component. That was not an accident. That was the point. That evening, I went out to the back porch for the first time since before the surgery. The Charlotte air was warm and unhurried. I sat down and I called Cheryl and we talked for 40 minutes about things that had nothing to do with Byron Hollis, her sister's new apartment, a restaurant she wanted to try, something small and funny that had happened to her at work that week. It was the first conversation like that in weeks. It was a small thing. It was also, in its own quiet way, everything. He did not call ahead. I heard the knock on a Saturday morning, and when I opened the door, my son was standing on the other side of it, looking like a man who had driven to this address before he fully decided he was coming. His father's jaw, my eyes. He was holding nothing. No flowers, no excuse. Just himself, standing there in the particular discomfort of someone who knows they owe a presence they don't yet know how to give. I stepped back and let him in. He sat on the living room couch and looked at his hands for a long moment. I sat across from him and waited. Not to punish him with the silence, because I had learned across these past weeks that filling silences for people who had hurt me was a habit that served neither of us. If he had come here, then he had come with something and I was going to let him find it himself. He said he didn't know about the money, about Solvi, about what his father had been running. He said it like a man putting something down that had become too heavy to carry without acknowledging the weight. Then he said the caption and stopped. He could not finish that sentence. He knew it, and I knew it, and we both sat with the fact that there was no version of that sentence that arrived somewhere acceptable. He did not try to find one. That was the first honest thing he had done in this room. He started again. He said, "Dad always said you were," and stopped again. He didn't finish it. He couldn't. But I heard the shape of it anyway. I heard 22 months of careful reframing, a mother who wasn't emotionally present, who prioritized everything over her family, who had checked out long before anyone else did. I heard the story Byron had built and tended and handed to his son gradually enough that Davian had stopped being able to see where his father's words ended and his own conclusions began. I did not say any of that aloud. Instead, I answered the question he hadn't asked yet. I told him what I remembered about his childhood, not as evidence, not as an argument constructed to dismantle his father's version, just as memory, mine, true, offered without agenda. I told him about the 4th grade school play. He forgot his lines midway through his scene and froze, and I laughed from the 3rd row, not at him, just at the specific comedy of that moment. And he saw me laughing from the stage, and something in him released, and he started laughing too. And the whole audience followed, and it became the funniest evening either of us had had in years. I told him about the summer he broke his arm, how he didn't want to be alone at night and didn't want to have to ask me twice, so I moved a blanket to the floor of his room for 6 nights without him having to say anything after the first time. I told him he used to call my name from the other end of the house when he was small, not because he needed something, just to hear me answer, just to confirm I was there. He sat very still through all of it. He did not cry. He looked at me the way someone looks at something they are trying to reconcile with a version they were given and believed for a long time. When he stood to leave, I walked him to the door. He hugged me, brief, slightly stiff, the specific physical awkwardness of 2 people remembering how to be in contact with each other after distance. I watched him walk to his car. I did not call after him. I did not know what he would do with what I had given him, and I understood that I did not control that. I went back inside. That evening, my phone buzzed once. A text from Loria. 2 words. He talked, I read it. I set the phone down. I did not need anything more than that tonight. Byron moved out on a Wednesday. He did not leave because he chose to. The legal proceedings had made continued cohabitation untenable, and Renata had structured the filing from the beginning to protect my occupancy rights specifically. He packed what he needed into 2 trips, and he was gone by early afternoon. I was not home when it happened. That was deliberate. I had no interest in watching him perform dignity on his way out of a house he had already left, in every way that mattered. Cheryl told me later he had taken the charcoal gray suit. I thought about that for a moment, and then I let it go. Renata called me that Thursday with an update delivered in her usual, unornamented way. Byron's attorney had advised him against contesting the dissipation claim. The documentation across both legal proceedings had made that position difficult to defend. The $8,400 marital transfer, sitting in the record of 2 separate courts simultaneously, was not something his counsel could argue around without making things considerably worse. Byron's opening negotiating position from weeks earlier had narrowed significantly. The room Renata had described as limited had grown smaller still. Solvi's civil case was moving toward settlement. Byron had chosen not to proceed to discovery. Discovery would have required producing everything, and everything was not something he could afford to have produced. The settlement itself would remain private between the parties, but the civil filing, the dismissal, and the allegations attached to the case would still sit in the public court record under his name. Anyone searching hard enough would find the shape of what happened. In Charlotte's business circles, that was enough. I did not celebrate any of this. I received it the way I had learned to receive most things in these past weeks, as information, noted, processed, filed. Loria told me something that week that I thought about more than the legal updates. She said Davian had called his father. She did not know the specifics of what was said. Davian had made the call privately and had not repeated it to her in detail. What she knew was that afterward he had gone quiet in a particular way. Not the performed quiet of a man managing his reactions, the internal quiet of someone turning something over carefully that they had previously carried without examining. She said he had begun asking himself questions she could see him sitting with, not aloud, not to her, just in the particular quality of his stillness in the evenings. She said it was slow. She said it was not finished. She said it had started. Things that start, I thought, don't always stop. Byron's name in Charlotte had taken on a specific texture, not scandal. Scandal is loud and temporary. This was quieter and more durable than that. People who had considered him a credible professional contact had quietly reclassified him as a liability. No one had organized that response. It had simply emerged from the accumulated weight of what was now sitting in court records and what had passed around Dwight Calloway's dinner table. Dwight himself had said nothing publicly. He had simply stopped including Byron in things. Invitations that would have arrived no longer did. In the community Byron had spent years cultivating, that silence was its own complete and irreversible sentence. I was sleeping through the night again. I want to be precise about what that means. For weeks my body had been keeping a kind of vigil even while I rested, waking at sounds, tracking the quality of the dark, holding something even in sleep. That had stopped. I was going to bed, and I was staying there, and I was waking in the morning without the specific exhaustion of a woman whose nervous system has been on duty around the clock. That was not a small thing. That was everything. 6 months moved through Charlotte the way time moves when you have stopped measuring it against someone else's behavior. Steadily, without drama. belonging entirely to you. The divorce finalized on a Thursday morning. I was not in the courtroom when the judge signed it. Renata called me at 11:47 and told me it was done. I was in my kitchen. I said, "Thank you." She said, "You're welcome," and that was the end of the most important professional relationship I had formed in the past 6 months. Clean. Sufficient. Exactly what it needed to be. North Carolina's equitable distribution had produced an outcome shaped entirely by what the documentation showed. I retained the house. I received a compensatory distribution that accounted for the dissipated marital funds, and the $8,400 transfer Byron had used to build credibility he did not have. I was awarded long-term spousal support that Byron's documented adultery and financial conduct left him in very little position to challenge. Not as punishment, as consequence. The distinction mattered to me. Renata had done exactly what Cheryl said she would do with something she should win. The legal process itself had not moved overnight. There were filings, responses, financial disclosures, scheduling delays, attorney calls I was not present for, weeks where nothing visible seemed to happen at all. But over time, the documentation narrowed Byron's room steadily until most of the negotiating happened around terms rather than denial. By the final month, the outcome no longer surprised anybody involved except, perhaps, Byron himself. I sent Cheryl flowers the following morning. She called me and told me they were unnecessary. I told her I knew. Solvy's civil settlement had closed 3 weeks before the divorce finalized. I knew because she texted me. 2 words, "It's done." I wrote back 4, "Thank you for the folder." She sent nothing after that, and neither did I. We were not friends. We did not need to be. We were 2 women who had been positioned as enemies by the same man and had chosen instead to be honest with each other at the precise moment that honesty was most costly and most necessary. That has its own integrity. It does not require friendship to validate it. Davian and Loria came for Sunday dinner 3 weeks after the divorce closed. It was the first time in years that my son had sat at my table. I cooked the things I knew how to cook well, and I set the table properly, and when they knocked, I opened the door and let them in without ceremony. It was not seamless. There were careful pauses where ease used to live and a politeness between Davian and me that had not yet softened into the older, more comfortable thing it used to be. We were rebuilding in the specific way that real things rebuild. Slowly, without announcements. One ordinary moment placed beside another. Midway through dinner, Davian asked about the garden on the back porch. I had mentioned it to him once, weeks ago, briefly. He had held on to it. That small act of retention, of paying attention to something I had said and carrying it forward, told me more about where he was than anything he could have put into words. I told him about it. After we ate, we went outside and I showed him. The things just beginning to grow and the things already coming in. He crouched down and looked at something close to the soil and asked a question about it. And I answered. And Loria stood nearby with her arms folded against the evening air, and the 3 of us stayed out there longer than made practical sense. Standing behind my own house in the warm, Charlotte evening with my son beside me, looking at something I was tending, I felt something I want to name carefully. Not happiness exactly, not peace exactly. Something more specific than either. The particular texture of a life that has come back into your own hands after being held by someone who never had the right to hold it. I did not think about Byron that night. I went inside. I washed the dishes. I turned off the kitchen light. I walked through every room of my house in the quiet of an evening that belonged entirely to me. Every room was completely mine. That is where my story ends.